Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever the fuck you're watching this. This is Tailgate Trash Talk, and we've got a special episode tonight because we've got a heated feud in football's hotbed. And I wish Stove could be here tonight to talk with me. I want to get his insights, but I can promise you we share some similar sentiments on this. So um, we're going to talk Saban, we're going to talk Jimbo, and we're going to talk about this crazy feud over NIL, over collectives, over recruiting classes. Everyone's calling names and throwing barbs, and Jimbo's calling Saban the supposed god and czar of college football, and it's getting really interesting. And I think the most interesting insight we've had so far is from an unsurprising source, because Lane Kiffin has joined the fray with his Twitter entry, and he's had an interesting take, and I think we expected to get something along those lines from him because he is a guy who never ever pulls any punches. But let's start out setting a little bit of background here. So Saban calls out Jimbo Fisher for the number one recruiting class in the nation. And now you have to remember, Saban isn't talking to reporters. Saban's not doing an interview. He's not doing an exclusive. He's not doing any sort of press. He's talking to boosters, right, at a rally for Alabama. And he's emotional. I'm sure the environment there is jacked up. Everybody's pumped. Roll Tide, roll. Let's talk about recruits, and let's talk about our recruiting class and how we're going to get back to winning a national championship every single year. Get back on top of Georgia, continue to dominate the SEC, but the season ends short of a national championship at Alabama, and it's sort of a disappointment, right? Especially if you're a Tide fan. You want to see your team win the big game every year. This run of dominance has produced several championships, but it's never enough, right? For Alabama, they expect to win every year. So Saban gets out recruited by Texas A&M. A&M has the best recruiting class in history, based on the numbers, based on how many 5-stars in total, ESPN 100 and et cetera, right? They had an historic recruiting class. And in Alabama, of course, the boosters are wondering, hey, what's going on here? Why aren't we recruiting number one as we seem to every year, right? Alabama always has a great recruiting class. Well, Saban has an answer. And taken at surface value, taken at face value, it could be implying that they cheated. But we also have to remember that the tenor and the tone and the culture around money and exchanging hands and getting recruits in the door and paying athletes at the college level, it has changed over the last 12, 18 months, really. And probably we could talk about this in terms of the last decade or so. Northwestern tried to unionize, and we've had some efforts to really change the way that college athletes and amateurs, right, quote unquote amateurs, are handled at the NCAA level, right? Especially in these revenue generating sports like football, basketball, and in the ACC, especially. These revenue generating sports, you bring all this money into the college and the players want to get a piece of it, right? And previously, it always kind of had to be backdoor. We knew what was going on. Boosters are going to pay here, and, the Cam Newton stuff with his dad negotiating, and the, SMU with the, Pony Express and how much trouble they got in the death penalty, right? And Ole Miss, when Hugh Freeze was there, they had such great recruiting classes, and everybody's looking around like, how'd they do this, right? Is Hugh Freeze really that big of a deal when it comes to recruiting? Well, we look back and we see some of this stuff was going on. Well, now they've legalized it in the form of name, image, and likeness. And the NCAA has tried really hard to maintain some sort of control, right? Keep their thumb on the pulse, keep their hand, on the heads of these athletes as, hey, Dad, I'm not sure what's going on with audio. Hopefully I'm not just spitting into the vacuum here. If anybody else could chime in, let me know if I'm completely muted here. Really appreciate it. All indications are that I have my microphone working, so I'm not sure. Sorry. Try to maybe refresh or something along those lines. But anyway, so all that aside, if I find out I got no audio here, I guess I'm talking to myself. And listening to my own voice here. But, you know, I to get back on track, name, image, likeness, it's the NCAA is trying to maintain some control here, and it looks like they're trying to introduce some rules, right? And they're trying to make sure everybody plays by rules. And let's not make it the Wild Wild West, right? Which is what I think we all had a sneaky suspicion it could be, right? Stove and I have talked about this. If this is just the Wild Wild West, it could get really ugly, right? Some schools getting athletes coming in with millions and millions of dollars. You know, we had representatives from Oppendorf, you know, the vice president there, to talk to us about what it looks like with these NIL deals. And he said that there's some good deals that go on, but for the most part, it's these small time deals that athletes are doing, a commercial here, a social media plug there. So, you know, it's not necessarily right now the NIL, at least the official side of the house. It's not the Wild Wild West, right? And we've heard big numbers in the past, right? Eric Dickerson talks about how he got a Camaro, and then there's another player on the team that wanted a Trans Am, and you know, they wouldn't give it to him, so he blew the whistle on everything, or he didn't get a starting spot, so he blew the whistle on the whole program. I still think that we're going to have, and we look at Texas A&M, right? All that oil money, tycoons, and all the good old boys club that goes on down there in Texas. I still think we're going to have a lot of that with these NIL deals. Guys sneaking money here, sneaking money there. Hey, come to Texas A&M, and I don't want to single out Texas A&M, but I think that this NIL thing still has some ironing out. And Stove and I talked about it, I believe, last episode. It might even have been the episode before, that there's still work to do with ironing out the rules for the NIL, ironing out how everybody's going to manage themselves and govern themselves, right? Is it by conference? Is it by state? Is it by university? Is it per, you know, sport, right? There's a lot of ways to look at this, because Title IX also comes into play and says that, you know, female athletes, male athletes, and then you look at things like minority admissions and those sorts of things. And, you know, those with disabilities are supposed to be afforded the same opportunities, right? So if the football players at most universities or basketball players at other universities are getting all these big NIL deals, then you start to look at Title IX, right? Is this fair? Now, we can talk about it being a free market and them being able to set their own price, but that's not how it works in terms of what rules are in place with the NCAA. Title IX has a lot to say about equal opportunity, equal access, equal treatment across these sports. So I think that's a big consideration with that maybe Title IX is going to have to be considered and taken under careful consideration, so that we're not violating that, because we don't want to alienate players in other sports, right? Especially not based on sex or gender or race or any of that, right? We don't want to discriminate for those reasons. So we've got to make this work. And I think what we're seeing right now is Nick Saban doesn't like NIL, and he really doesn't like having a recruiting class go to another school where their NIL collective is pretty big. And a lot of the talk of that school, Texas A&M especially, is oil money. There's a lot of money there. They're going to be able to buy as many players as they want. Saban loses a recruiting class. A&M goes and has the best recruiting class in history. And suddenly we're hearing from Saban, there's some rumbling, and he's getting hyped up, talking with boosters, and he just says it, right? They bought their whole class. Well, it's a sweeping generalization that I'm sure that if Saban had time to consider prior to saying it, he would not have said it the way he said it. I think if he had been given an opportunity, now if this were a press conference, right, or an interview or another media session of some sort where he had time to prep and he wasn't just engaged with rambunctious boosters in this raucous environment that he was in, I think he would have said it very differently, right? I think he would have chosen his words much more carefully. I think he would have chosen the way, his tact, especially, instead of just saying they bought all their players, he might have gone into depth in terms of what the collective looks like, right? He's trying to get the boosters to spend more money on the university's NIL collective, right? At Bama. If you want us to be able to keep up, we've got to fund our own collective. And I think that's the important thing to think about with regards to, you know, what Saban's saying there and what he's trying to get across to the boosters. Now, he trampled an old friend, and I don't know that maybe they weren't as friendly as maybe we all thought they were, because Jimbo came back with some heavy words. But he trampled on an old friend, and he also trampled on kind of a new friend, right? All the Aflac commercials and Coach Prime and Coach Saban, and he alienates Coach Prime too by saying they paid the number one defensive back recruit in the country that had been committed to Florida State, flips and goes to an HBCU. We're not used to seeing these HBCUs get these big time recruits, right? There was a time, you know, that HBCUs were very dominant across all sports. It hasn't been that way for the last 40, maybe 50 years, right? It's been all these big universities, these public universities, these state universities going out and spending the money to build facilities, to bring up their, you know, it's the amenities, right? And their programs, and putting them together and putting the best coaches together. They've got the money to be able to spend like that. So they've kind of separated themselves from not just the HBCUs, but you look at Power 5, Group of 5, and then the also-rans, right? So there's a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots in college football, especially. And to see the number one defensive back recruit flip from one of those prominent universities that produces big-time defensive backs in the NFL, right? Jalen Ramsey is a shining example right now of a Florida State defensive back that is probably the best all-purpose defensive back in the league right now. It's something we're not used to seeing. And then there's a rumor and a report, and it has since been refuted by both Prime and the young man, and his name's eluding me right now, but it's been refuted by both that he didn't get the $1 million NIL deal that everybody says, or at least that report was. So Saban may be spouting off at the mouth with some inaccurate information too. And I think that goes back to, if Saban had an opportunity to prepare a statement, he'd have said it very, very differently. His point was that he wanted to get more money in their NIL Collective. Good to hear it, Dad. Glad you got the audio going. Appreciate you being here. But I think what Saban's really trying to do here is get some boosters to put some more money in, right? So that we can keep up, we can recruit in the same way. Now, Jimbo comes back and says what he says, right? That's the first response we heard was from Jimbo. He says, yeah, he's tried to call. We're done. You think he's the czar of football. We built him up to be the god of college football. Go dig up the skeletons from his graveyard, right? Ask any coach, any assistant coach that's ever worked with him. Well, Jimbo, buddy, tell us what you know. You were an assistant under Nick Saban. You won a national championship with Nick Saban when you were at LSU. What do you know, buddy? Or are you now going to try to tiptoe and say, well, it didn't happen under my watch, or I don't know anything because I wasn't that guy, right? So he kind of steps in it himself by saying, go dig up his past, go talk to other coaches. They'll tell you what you want to hear. You're the coach we want to hear from. You've got the mic in front of you. You're worked up. You're passionate about this. Tell us what you know. But he doesn't. He just continues to go in on Saban. You know, he talks about Saban's mad because he doesn't have the number one recruiting class. Somebody out recruited him, and now he's got to talk about how they don't have the money, or they don't have this, or somebody else cheated, or he's got all the cards are stacked in his favor, right? And they have been at Alabama. He took over Alabama when it was down, but Alabama is still Alabama in the football world, right? It's still the Bear Bryant, Alabama, the Mystique, Roll Tide Roll, that sort of stuff. So Tuscaloosa still kind of recruits itself when it comes to college football. Then you add Nick Saban to the mix, who won a national championship at LSU, was very successful at Michigan State, went to the NFL, was semi-successful, but then ran for the hills to Alabama the first opportunity he got to go back to college football. You add him to the mix, and suddenly you got what you got now, right? It's a juggernaut. It's a program that continues to win every year, put out NFL talent like crazy. They get 10, 12 guys drafted every year, it seems, across all positions too. It's not just Saban, the defensive guru. You're talking about guys like Julio Jones and DeVonta Smith and Jerry Jeudy and all those guys that are in the NFL right now, Calvin Ridley, and running backs, right? You got Mark Ingram, and you've got, Trent Richardson was a super high pick, and all these guys that Derrick Henry, who's borderline MVP candidate. So they are churning out guys every year. Mac Jones, right, won Rookie of the Year last year. So he's used to it being a certain way, and Jimbo has a point in terms of when things get disrupted or when your calm ocean gets a ripple. It's easy to look at it and say, well, here's what went wrong, or here's why I didn't do this, or here's what happened. And he's in front of boosters, worked up, says something that really gets under the skin of Jimbo Fisher. And we're going to talk about Jimbo again a little later, but I want to pause really quick, take a quick sponsor break here. Let's talk about Ryan Trotnick. Ryan Trotnick Construction Group here, Excel Constructors. This break is brought to you by Excel Constructors out of Overland Park, Kansas. We appreciate their support. For all your construction needs, contact Ryan Trotnick at excelconstructors.com. All right, so let's talk about Coach Prime and his response. All right, so we've seen him working with Nick Saban on Aflac commercials, right? And they seem to have some chemistry with the commercials. When you see them interact on a, at Senior Bowl and those sorts of things, when they're in the public eye and they're interacting, they seem to have some pretty good chemistry. They seem to get along. And then Saban goes and alienates Coach Prime as well and says he got $1 million to get the number one recruit to flip and come away from Florida State. And Coach Prime comes out and says, listen, he can call. I'm not going to answer the phone. He didn't go as far as to say he's done, right? Because Jimbo said we're done. He called. I'm not answering. We're done. Coach Prime said he can call. I'm not going to answer. If he wants to talk to me, we'll talk face to face. And I think they're going to have the opportunity because the commercials, but also because they're not hard to find, right? It wouldn't be hard for those two to link up. One, they're in Mississippi and Alabama, right? When it comes to, in season here. So I'll be very curious to hear and see how this develops with Saban and Coach Prime, because Coach Prime has said, I want to talk to him face to face, and I think they'll iron it out. And then Saban walks back, all right, and says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have singled out Texas A&M. I shouldn't have singled out Jackson State. And he says NIL collectives are the problem, right? And he may be onto something. He may have a gripe with NIL collectives because we're talking about basically it's a new mechanism, and it's a new world for college athletics, right? We have a guaranteed pool of money that universities can say, you come to Texas A&M, you come to Alabama, you come to Georgia, Ohio State, wherever you're going to go, and you're going to get X amount of dollars from this pool, right? And boosters are putting money in it. And rumor has it that A&M is somewhere north of $50,000 per player. Now, if I'm a high school student who's a highly touted recruit, and a school comes to me and says, if you just attend our university, we're going to pay for your tuition, we're going to pay for room and board, you're on a full athletic scholarship, you're going to get a monthly stipend for your cost of living, and you're going to get $50,000 straight up from this pool of NIL money just to be part of the university, and you can still go out and get other NIL deals. I think that's pretty enticing, right? It's hard to say no to something along those lines, on top of the fact that you're already talking about going to a prestigious university in Texas A&M, all right? So I think there's some smoke there to what Saban is saying. The NIL collectives are going to present a challenge because some universities are going to be able to put in more money. You look at the Texas schools with all the oil money there. You look at the California schools with all the entertainment dollars, the banking dollars, and those sorts of things. And then the Midwest with some of the banking stuff and the big farm money, right? So you're looking at some schools that are going to be able to put in money. And I think Saban looks at this and says, well, hell, I'm in Tuscaloosa. We don't exactly produce people that just go out and say make billions and billions and billions of dollars on the regular. We don't have oil money. We don't have all these other things. Are we going to fall behind in terms of NIL collectives? And am I going to have a long-term struggle here? Right? So there's some smoke to it. And I do believe when he says, I didn't intend to single them out. I just I dislike the NIL collectives. I think they're the problem, right? I do believe he's sincere in the fact that he didn't go into that conversation intending to single out Jimbo and single out Coach Prime. I do believe, as I said earlier in the episode, given time to prepare, he wouldn't have said it like that. He would have said it very differently. He would have calculated it, measured it, and said, NIL collectives are the problem. If you look at a school like Texas A&M that has a big NIL collective deal, right, that might be a little more of what he would have said had he been given time. But in that hostile, that charged up environment with the boosters, he just kind of jumped in and said, yeah, they bought all their players, because it was kind of the emotional thing to say, which isn't something we normally come to expect from Saban. Normally, he's a pretty calculated guy. I think in this instance, he let emotion get to him and he said something he didn't mean to say. So he apologizes, and then Jimbo Fisher yesterday comes out and has more to say. I'm sorry, 2 days ago, not yesterday. Jimbo Fisher comes out just 2 days ago, a handful of days after Saban has apologized, has publicly walked it back and said, I didn't mean to do what I did. I apologize. It's not, it wasn't there. Jimbo Fisher comes out and says, well, one of our players got an NIL deal. He was the only one. So he's still trying to assert his innocence when everybody's trying to kind of let it fade into Bolivia, to quote Mike Tyson. Everybody just wants this to go away, right? The NCAA wants it to go away. Saban, Alabama, Texas A&M, they want it to go away because nobody wants investigations into the actual skeletons buried in the backyards of all of these programs, of all of these coaches. Nobody fares well. Everybody gets in trouble if they're going to start digging into any of these guys' past. So Jimbo needs to kind of back it down a little bit. I think he sounds guilty, right? He sounds guilty by continuing the conversation long after everybody kind of wants it to just fade away. All right. And then we get a response from Lane Kiffin via the Twitter sphere. So Ben Daniel types up this quote, and then Lane Kiffin shares it and then says he nailed it, right? He nailed it. Jimbo, typo, had the nerve to say it wasn't NIL, says everyone is coming to A&M because it's just a great place to be. Well, Jimbo's been at A&M since 2018. He's had recruiting classes with 0, 2, 2, and 1 5-star recruits, as you can see from the graphic. And then NIL is introduced, 7 5 stars, highest rated class of all time. Lane goes on to add, or I'm sorry, Ben Daniels said it, and then Lane said he nailed it. It makes perfect logic. After they lost to Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Arkansas, LSU, they finished 4-4 in the SEC. It was clear to the nation's elite recruits that this was a program on the rise. Nailed it. Shade to the highest degree. And I would expect nothing less from Lane Kiffin. And I legitimately was talking to Stove after all of this came out, and I said the one voice that I can't wait to hear, and Stove agreed completely. The one voice we were waiting to hear was this voice, Lane Kiffin, because he never pulls punches. And it's right there in front of everybody's eyes. What changed from 2018 through 2021 to 2022? NIL was introduced. Now, am I implying that there's anything shady going on there? No, but it doesn't have to be shady. You can do NIL deals, and you can say, we've got this collective, and you've got the opportunity in College Station or College Junction to do all of these different things, College Station, but all of these different things. And it sells, right? It plays with recruits, especially in the charged atmosphere that it is right now with regards to NIL, right? It's on the tip of everybody's tongue. Everybody's talking about how college players are getting paid. They're getting paid. They're getting paid. So you can say all you want that it's just about Texas A&M, good program, yada, 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 but the numbers don't lie. And the facts are the facts, right? It's back to back to back to back, mediocre to above average classes in the SEC, right? You got to remember that A&M's an SEC school, so having the top 15 to 30 recruiting class is sort of an above average to average recruiting class. SEC schools that are at the top, Georgia, Bama, LSU, they're constantly in the top 5 to 10 schools with their recruiting classes, right? So that's a good recruiting class for the SEC. Jimbo hasn't done that at A&M consistently, right? And he has not gotten 7 5-star recruits. He's never gotten more than 2. So something changed, and we see it. And Lane Kiffin says it, and I love Lane Kiffin's response. So what I want to finish with is I want to finish a little bit with the talk about NIL collectives, right? And I'm going to reiterate that Stove and I talked early on when this NIL thing started that there was the possibility that this thing could get out of control, right? That there was the possibility it could be the Wild West, or there was a possibility it could go unregulated, the possibility NCAA would lose control. We even talked about the fact that, like, the SEC could just break away and start their own football thing, right? Bring along X number of schools with them and make it a 32-team conference or something along those lines, right? Something that mimics maybe a professional sports league, right? 32 is a round number, but the NFL has 32 teams, right? So we talked about the possible fallout, or at least what we suspected as like worst case scenarios with NIL. And I don't think we've seen it quite play out like that, right? We had the open doors conversation about how that works. We've seen this with NIL. They're talking about collectives. We've also seen the NCAA come out and say, we're going to start putting a little bit of controls in place. We're going to continue to assert the fact that we still regulate this quote unquote nonprofit, right? What I worry about is sort of what Saban is saying, right? And I don't feel bad for Nick Saban. I really don't. I never would. I worry about the competitiveness in recruiting classes beyond the SEC, Big Ten, and maybe the Pac-12, right? I worry about how these schools are going to stay competitive when it's the same 5, 10, 15 schools, maybe 20 schools from these 3 or maybe 4 if you want to throw the Big 12 in there. What are these other schools going to do, right? What are they going to do to stay competitive? And you look at a conference like the ACC that's already very top heavy. Every single year, it's one team does well and the rest suck. I've talked about the fact the ACC is not a Power 5 school anymore. But if they want to establish themselves as part of that group of Power 5 schools and get back to prominence, right? When Miami and Florida State and Pitt and some of the other schools were good and Clemson was competitive and North Carolina could compete, what do they have to do? Well, they don't have the football money that these other schools do, right? A&M's a football school, Bama's a football school, LSU football school, USC football school, Oregon football school with Nike dollars, right? UCLA football school with Hollywood dollars. So you're talking about these schools that are very, very powerful in terms of being in these conferences. And then let's talk about the Big 12. Texas has its own fucking TV network, right? Didn't become the recruiting tool that we thought it would because they haven't had a good recruiting class and delivered on that recruiting class in a long time. But they're still right there in the center of oil country, right? Oklahoma, again, they seem to be able to compete every year. Norman's got a lot of money flowing through it. You look at Ohio State, right? Michigan, these schools that have these big time booster packages. And then you look at everybody else in the conference. I think that gap between the haves and the have-nots is going to spread. And I think that's what the NCAA, for all of their faults, I would never take the NCAA's back in terms of saying that they've done things the right way. But I will say that what the NCAA is worried about and what Nick Saban has said in not as good of terms, not as calculated of terms, is these NIL things could create a bigger gap, right? If A&M's got a $50,000 per athlete NIL deal, you know, other schools are going to have, oh, here's $1,000, right? Or here's $1,500. And that's an easy decision for a lot of student athletes. So I do worry, and I wonder what they're going to be able to do in terms of regulating it. I think we're going to have probably a 5, maybe as many as 7. I don't think it's going to be as long as 10, but 5 or so years where things are still feeling themselves out with this NIL thing, and the NCAA is trying to gain control or regain control. Everybody's trying to regulate it. Everybody's trying to get within compliance. Everybody's trying to understand what compliance looks like, right? And then I think we're going to start to see this NIL thing be productive, right? We're going to see NIL turn into a tool that helps the student athlete, that also makes us not feel so grimy about how much money the NCAA and how much money these schools are making off of the student athlete, right? That has not been paid officially, not been paid in the past. So I think NIL is going to evolve, and I think these NIL collectives are going to evolve as well. I think there's still going to be some disparity between the top 15, 20 schools and the rest of the country. 150, I think it's like 156 schools, 157 schools now in Division One, in the FBS. I think there's still going to be a disparity between the top schools, but I think it's going to narrow as we progress through this and figure it out, because there's a steep learning curve when you introduce something like this. You know, with the snap of a finger, the NCAA did it, and they didn't do it the right way. We've talked about this in the past, that they should have rolled this out. It should have been a 2, 3, 4 year effort to get this thing going, but they were so stubborn for so long, saying, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. They're amateur athletes. They're student athletes. We got to buy another yacht. I got to buy another, Mercedes, yada, 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 that they really shot themselves in the foot by just jumping in, right? So I think over the next handful of years, we're going to see NIL evolve, and we're going to see the conferences embrace it more. We're going to see states regulate it, and we're going to probably see some federal regulation. We talked that, the Congress needs to stay kind of on task, right? But I think we're going to see some federal regulation in terms of how this works, similar to how professional athletes are compensated for, their endorsements, and how that's all taxed, and how you stay in compliance, and how you manage that as well. So I think we're going to start to see regulating bodies kind of pile on each other, and we're going to get to a good solution, but it's going to take time. I think it's going to be good for the game. I think it's going to be good for the student athlete. But I do think that we are going to go through some major growing pains, and we're going to see more outbursts like this over the next handful of years. Wouldn't be surprised to see it from Harbaugh and the boys up in Ann Arbor bitching about the guys down in Columbus. So we're going to see more of this. I really like what we saw from Lane. I enjoy listening to Jimbo try to assert more of his innocence. He sounds like when one of my kids gets in trouble and tries to come back to me later and try to explain it, right? Like, no, I wasn't lying because I said this, or I didn't do anything wrong because I did this or I said that. That's what it sounds like to me with Jimbo, and it's funny to see that from a grown man. But I also think he realized after he said what he said about Saban, like, I might have stepped in it there. So I think he may have forgotten that he was an assistant coach under Saban at one point or something. But I like the entertainment value of it. I think this is what we can expect in the future, a few more of these outbursts over the next handful of years before we really get our hands and, get our minds around what this NIL thing looks like long-term, and how we make it sustainable, but also how we make it work for the student athlete and not, feel like something that the NCAA is just pissed off about, and coaches like Saban are just pissed off about. So that brings us to the conclusion. Shorter episode this week, but a couple of important topics to talk about here. A couple entertaining topics, especially the Saban and Jimbo feud. Curious to see how that plays out. I can't wait till A&M and Bama play. I want to see the hostility. I'd love to see the coach shoulders and no handshakes. And if there's any verbal barbs exchanged in pregame and postgame conferences there, when that matchup comes through. And I'm really curious to see how Saban and Prime end up, because I feel like, I mentioned it. I think they have some chemistry with the commercials. They seem to really kind of feed off each other a bit there, but also when I've seen them interact outside of that setting, I think that they see eye to eye kind of on, everyone's just striving toward greatness. That's always been Prime's big thing. So curious to see how it plays out, but we will see you again in a couple of weeks. This has been the latest episode of Tailgate Trash Talk, talking rivalries down in the SEC. Appreciate everyone coming out, everyone that's watching up there. Appreciate the support. We are out.